What if I told you
that there are a group of black Indians
that created the largest haven in the U.S. for escaped slaves?
I told you that this is the true story of the Black Seminoles.
They were the strongest alive. They were ready to die to live. You can never find this taught in school because they were so historically unbelievable. Imagine the pain, escaping slavery, the hunger, the thirst, the long trek to safety called the Trail of Tears. The resolved determination for mutual respect, equality, and freedom. And they'd rather die to get there. That's the incredible story of the Black Seminoles. They were warriors of freedom, a cornerstone of a unique culture that historically defied the American predatory foundation for all time. Known as the Black Seminoles or Seminole Freedmen, these were a community derived from runaway slaves who eventually integrated into American Indian culture. The Seminoles were unconquered people, descendants of just 300 Indians who had resiliently and very fiercely refused capture by the US in the 19th century. They were mostly Gullah fugitives who escaped from the rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, who joined with the newly formed Seminole groups who also had broken away from the Muskogee or Creek people. Both groups were fleeing the decimation of their cultures and people by European-brought violence and disease and sought refuge in the Florida forests. Today, more than 2,000 of them live on 6 reservations in the state, located in Hollywood, Big Cypress, Brighton, Immokalee, Eft, Pierce, and Tampa. Seminole history begins with bands of Creek Indians from Georgia and Alabama who migrated to Florida in the 1700s. Conflicts with Europeans and other tribes had caused them to seek out new lands where they could live in peace. Groups of lower Creeks had moved to Florida to get away from the dominance of upper Creeks. Some Creeks were searching for rich new fields to plant corn, beans, and other crops. For a while, Spain even encouraged these migrations to help provide a buffer between Florida and the British colonies. The Seminoles had built their own settlements on the Florida frontier, fought a series of wars to preserve their freedom, and were scattered across North America. They have played a significant role in American history, but never did receive the recognition that was due them. Get ready to dive into a tale of resistance, resilience, and a powerful alliance that rewrites what you thought you knew about American history. Do not forget to like, share, and better still, subscribe to stay with us. This is going to be an interesting ride. Africans have a more than 400-year history in Florida, beginning with the Spanish exploration of the coast and the St. Johns River. The first Africans to reach Seminole County could have been among the early Spanish explorers of the St. Johns River, and certainly were among the escaping plantation slaves of the British colonial years and the later American expansion in the southeast. Some Gullah slaves, which is what they're also called, managed to escape. From coastal South Carolina and Georgia, south into the Florida Peninsula. In the 18th century, Florida was a vast tropical wilderness covered with jungles and malaria-ridden swamps. The Spanish claimed Florida, but they used it only as a buffer between the British colonies and their own settled territories farther south. They wanted to keep Florida as a dangerous wilderness frontier, so they offered a refuge to escaped slaves and renegade Indians from neighboring South Carolina and Georgia. The Gullahs were establishing their own free settlements in the Florida wilderness by at least the late 1700s. They built separate villages of thatched roof houses surrounded by fields of corn and swamp rice, and they maintained friendly relations with the mixed population of refugee Indians. In time, the two groups came to view themselves as parts of the same loosely organized tribe, in which blacks held important positions of leadership. The Black Gullahs had adopted Indian clothing, while the Indians acquired a taste for rice and appreciation for Gullah music and folklore. But the Gullahs were physically more suited to the tropical climate and possessed an indispensable knowledge of tropical agriculture. And, without their assistance, the Indians would not have been able to cope effectively with the Florida environment. The two groups led an independent life in the wilderness of northern Florida, rearing several generations of children in freedom, and they recognized the American settlers and slave owners as their common enemy. The Americans called the Florida Indians Seminoles, from the Spanish word Cimarron, meaning wild or untamed, and they called the runaway Gullahs Seminole Negroes, or Indian Negroes. Something very interesting was occurring within the interior of Florida throughout the 1700s and early 1800s. Villages of Creek Indian farmers drifted into uninhabited parts of Florida during this period. They had little contact with the Spanish authorities in St. Augustine. The Spanish didn't dare try to evict the Creeks because of their past unpleasant experiences in combating them. The last time the Spanish tried to invade the Creek Nation in 1703, they left behind around 600 bodies lying on the battlefield. The Creeks did not adopt Spanish traditions or religion. These Creeks in Florida eventually became known as Seminoles because they did not have strong political connections with the Creek provinces to the north. However, even as late as 1776, the Seminoles were merely considered a division of the Creek Confederacy, not a separate tribe. This is how botanist William Bartram described his contacts with the Seminoles in 1776. Simultaneously, Africans had continued to escape from plantations in the southern colonies and sought refuge in Florida. It was much easier for the African slaves to escape farms and plantations along the interior frontier because there were virtually no law enforcement officers in these regions. Of course, the Creeks had a long history of sedentary living and well-planned towns, but the Africans had often been treated as little more than livestock by planters. One of the many delusions held by white planters was that Africans were incapable of surviving without the management of white people. Almost immediately after gaining their freedom, the Africans began establishing orderly, clean villages and planting crops in northern Florida. They developed local governments modeled after those of the Creeks. However, the absorption of Native American culture went far beyond politics. The Africans had switched to wearing Creek clothings. They had also learned to speak the Itsate Creek language instead of either English or African. Itsate was the predominant language of South Carolina and Georgia Creeks. What is even more surprising is that the Black Seminoles also adopted the Creeks' ancient monotheistic religion, which was similar to that of the Hebrews before the building of Solomon's Temple, and also the Samaritan sect today. Unlike some other monotheistic religions, Creek and Black Seminole women were equal to the men in all ways. In fact, the women owned most of the real estate. However, under the conditions of liberty in Florida, the Black Seminoles flourished. U.S. Army Lieutenant George McCall recorded his impressions of a Black Seminole community in 1826. This, he had said, "We found these Negroes in possession of large fields of the finest land, producing large crops of corn, beans, melons, pumpkins, and other esculent vegetables. I saw, while riding along the borders of the ponds, fine rice growing, and in the village large corn cribs were filled, while the houses were larger and more comfortable than those of the Indians themselves." The remote regions of Seminole County were sanctuaries for many Africans, the allies of the Seminoles during 3 wars and hostilities during the early to mid-1800s. Along the sparsely populated regions of the St. Johns River, blacks became accomplished woodsmen, hunters, and fishermen. Some became prominent leaders as well as guides and interpreters. They used plantation-learned skills to farm and build shelters. The United States, which acquired Florida in 1821, moved army troops and supplies along the St. Johns and other rivers during its campaigns against the Seminoles and their black allies. Many of these people originally had been captured from African fighting tribes. The Seminoles welcomed them as capable warriors and skilled farmers and allowed them to form their own villages. Many too would be sent to the reservations west of the Mississippi River. From their ranks, the U.S. Army had later on recruited the Buffalo Soldiers of Western law. For the most part, Seminoles and Africans were more like allies against common threats. The U.S. Army, planters, slave hunters, and growing waves of new settlers that led to generational warfare just before slavery split the nation into North versus South. Now let's get down to the basic gist. After the American Revolution, 1776 to 1783, Spain regained control of Florida from Britain as part of the Treaty of Paris. When the British evacuated Florida, Spanish colonists as well as settlers from the newly formed United States came pouring in. Many of these new residents were lured by favorable Spanish terms for acquiring property, called land grants. Even Seminoles were encouraged to set up farms because they provided a buffer between Spanish Florida and the United States. Escaped slaves also entered Florida, trying to reach a place where their U.S. masters had no authority over them. Instead of becoming more Spanish, Florida increasingly became more American. Back when Britain controlled Florida, the British often incited Seminoles against American settlers who were migrating south into Seminole territory. These old conflicts, combined with the safe haven Seminoles provided black slaves, caused the U.S. Army to attack the tribe in the First Seminole War, 1817 to 1818, which took place in Florida and southern Georgia. Forces under General Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida, attacked several key locations, and pushed the Seminoles farther south into Florida. Finally, after several official and unofficial U.S. military expeditions into the territory, Spain formally ceded Florida to the United States in 1821, according to terms of the Adams-Onis Treaty. Damn it! These people were betrayed first by the Spaniards, who never for once cared for the consequences that would befall those whom they've used as buffers for so many years. However, the Seminole settlements in Spanish Florida had kept increasing as more and more runaway slaves and renegade Indians escaped south, and conflict with the Americans had become, sooner or later, inevitable. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson would lead the American army into Florida to claim it for the United States for good. And in doing this, the Seminole War finally erupted. As soon as the United States acquired Florida, it began urging the Indians there to leave their lands and relocate along with other southeastern tribes to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Some Seminole leaders signed a treaty in 1832, and part of the tribe moved. But other Seminoles refused to recognize the treaty and fled into the Florida Everglades. The Black Seminoles and Indians fought side by side as military allies throughout the bloody Seminole Wars, in a desperate struggle to stop the American advance. Andrew Jackson had referred to this First Seminole War as an Indian and Negro War. The thing was, the US government had also planned to rid Florida of Seminoles and capture Africans who had fled American plantations and found sanctuary among the Seminoles in the former Spanish colony. The Seminoles, too, had fled to Spanish Florida after wars and conflicts among rival Creeks of the American Southeast. Andrew Jackson, first as an American general and later as president, pushed a policy of removing all of the tribes to remote land west of the Mississippi River. The Seminoles resisted the drive to push them into western lands occupied by Creeks, whose slaves were treated much the same as those on American plantations. After the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, the US government attempted to relocate Seminoles to Oklahoma, causing yet another war, the Second Seminole War. The Treaty of Payne's Landing, signed by a small number of Seminoles in May 1832, required Indians to give up their Florida lands within 3 years and move west. When the US Army arrived in 1835 to enforce the treaty, the Indians were ready for war. As Major Francis Dade marched from Fort Brooke toward Fort King, 180 Seminole warriors led by Micanopy, Alligator and Jumper attacked. Only one man of that army detachment survived the ambush. The campaigns of the Second Seminole War were an outstanding demonstration of guerrilla warfare by the Seminoles. The Micos Jumper, Alligator, Micanopy and Osceola, leading less than 3,000 warriors, were pitted against 4 US generals and more than 30,000 troops. The Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, usually referred to as the Seminole War proper, was the fiercest war waged by the US government against American Indians. The United States spent more than $20 million fighting the Seminoles. The war left more than 1,500 soldiers and uncounted American civilians dead. And the obvious duplicity of the US government's tactics marred Indian-white relations throughout the country for future generations. As the hostilities dragged on, frustrated US forces increasingly turned to desperate measures to win the war. For example, Osceola was captured and imprisoned when he met with US troops who had called for a truce and claimed to want to talk peace. With Osceola in prison, the United States was confident the war would end soon, but it did not. Although Osceola died in prison in 1838, other Seminole leaders kept the battle going for a few more years. In 1842, a nominal end to the hostilities arrived, though no peace treaty was ever signed. By this time, most Seminoles had been moved from Florida, relocated to Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma. A third Seminole War broke out in 1855, when conflicts, largely over land, arose between whites and some Seminoles who remained in Florida. Constant military patrols and rewards for the capture of Indians had reduced the Seminole population to roughly about 300 remaining in Florida when the Third Seminole War ended in 1858. These ones hid in the swamps for over a decade. The Black Seminoles waged the fiercest resistance, as they feared that capture or surrender meant death or return to slavery. They hadn't only killed, they had killed twice. The American commander, General Jessup, informed the War Department that this, you may be assured, is a Negro and not an Indian war. And a US congressman of the period commented that these black fighters were contending against the whole military power of the United States. The black Seminoles had fled the rice plantations, built their own free settlements in the Florida wilderness, and then fought almost continuously for 50 years to preserve their freedom. It is little wonder they should provide some of the finest soldiers in the US cavalry. While studying the then hidden story of Native American slavery, Florida anthropologist John Worth came to the conclusion that at least 600,000 indigenous people in southeastern North America had been abducted into slavery. Slave raiders typically only took with them young women and teenagers. The men, defending their families, were killed by European slave raiders. The native tribe slave raiders usually tortured and killed all men of military age, plus butchered the toddlers who could not make the walk back to coastal slave markets. Thus, at least 600,000 Native Americans died as a result of slave raids. The big problem with Native American slaves, though, was that unless they were sold to plantations on Caribbean islands, they often found a way to escape back to Indian tribes within the interior. After King Charles II of England became personally involved in the African slave trade, African slaves became preferred by customers in the British colonies. Almost all of the British colonies, including Georgia after 1752 and Canada after 1763, but excluding Pennsylvania, legalized the slavery of Africans. Thus, the lives of African slaves and Native Americans had become interwoven. Books and newspaper articles were even published, then in the Carolinas, which promoted scientific breeding programs for mixing these two races to create ideal slaves. These documents are absolutely repugnant to modern eyes because they present non-European humans as being no different than cattle or horses. Human slavery had only been a legally sanctioned institution in the North American colonies for 5 years, when the colony of Charlestown was founded in 1670. By 1710, 20% of South Carolina's population was Native American slaves and 40% was African slaves. During this period, most African slaves had only a minimal knowledge of English. In their isolation on the coastal rice plantations, they had evolved a new language that is called Gullah today. It mixed the words of several African languages with words of the Creek Indians and English. Owners of African slaves, fresh off the ship in New York, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, had quickly discovered that many of these people died during the harsh North American winters. Over the eons, they had evolved bodies which thrived in the hot, humid tropical climate of West Africa, but were very vulnerable to cold temperatures. Those that happened to mate with indigenous American slaves produced offsprings, whose more muscular, heavy-boned physiques were much more tolerant to wintertime. The African slaves were only able to orient themselves to this strange new land by listening to the words of the Native American slaves. The indigenous and mustee slaves told of a land to the south called La Florida, where slavery was now illegal. The boldest slaves found ways to escape their bondage. Some Africans accompanied their indigenous friends to native towns in the interior, but with that came the risk of being captured by English bounty hunters at any time. For slaves to obtain secure freedom meant a dangerous walk in bare feet of over 100 miles to the border of La Florida. Along the way were dangerous swamps filled with several species of poisonous snakes and alligators. Most of these freedom seekers were only dressed in rags and carried little or no food with them. As early as 1687, African slaves fled from the South Carolina Lowcountry to Spanish Florida seeking freedom. Despite Spain's despicable treatment of America's indigenous peoples in the 1500s, human slavery had now been banned. Under an edict from Philip the Fine of Spain in 1693, the black fugitives received liberty in exchange for converting to Catholicism and defending the Spanish settlers at St. Augustine for at least 4 years. However, most of the black militia was more than happy to be permanently allowed to kill English-speaking invaders. After the province of Georgia was colonized immediately north of La Florida in 1788, the Spanish organized the Africans into a militia led by a man named Francisco Menendez. He was a Mandingo from Africa who had escaped a South Carolina plantation in 1724 and rose to the rank of an officer under the flag of Spain. The African militia unit was based at Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, meaning Royal Thanks of St. Teresa of the Town of Moses. It came to be known as Fort Mose. A formally planned settlement was founded around 1738. It was the first legally sanctioned free black town in North America. Contemporary sketches of the fortress suggest that it strongly resembled a fortified Mandingo village with the addition of Spanish bastions on the corners. In 1740, Fort Mose was attacked by an English army from Georgia under General James Edward Oglethorpe. The occupants fled to Castillo de San Marcos, but the African militia returned in force to attack the English troops there, killing all but about 30 of them. The fort and settlement was rebuilt in 1752, but abandoned in 1763, when Spain and France lost the 7 Years' War, and Great Britain had gained ownership of Florida. However, in the long run down the 1800s, when the army captured the Black Seminoles at some point, the US government had refused to return them to slavery, fearing that these seasoned warriors, accustomed to their freedom, would turn the Seminole War into a widespread slave rebellion. That alliance ended in 1838 when the United States offered to recognize the freedom of the Black Seminoles and pay them money if they would lay down their arms and agree to move to the Indian Territory. Over 500 Black Seminoles took up the offer. Once in the West, many Black Seminoles adapted to the lifestyle of the plains. Most were already expert horsemen. Some became cowboys. Many Black Seminoles accepted an offer from Mexico to form a border patrol to combat Comanche and Apache raiders. In 1850, a group of Black Seminoles and Seminole Indians escaped south across Texas to the desert badlands of northern Mexico. They established a free settlement and, as in Florida, began to attract runaway slaves from across the border. In 1855, a heavily armed band of Texas Rangers rode into Mexico to destroy the Seminole settlement, but the blacks and Indians stopped them and forced them back into the US. The Indians soon returned to Oklahoma, but the Black Seminoles remained in Mexico, fighting constantly to protect their settlement from the marauding Comanche and Apache Indians. In 1870, after emancipation of the slaves in the United States, the US cavalry in southern Texas invited some of the Black Seminoles to return and join the army. Wildcat and John Horse, leaders among separate groups of Seminoles and Black Seminoles who were forced to accept reservation land in the Oklahoma Territory, moved to Texas, then across the Rio Grande to live in the mountains of Nacimiento in the Mexican state of Coahuila. The Mexican government, which banned slavery in the years before war between the Union and the Confederacy, allowed the Seminoles and Black Seminoles to stay and raise cattle and plant crops in return for providing warriors to patrol the Mexican border with Texas and create a line of defense from raids into Mexico from other tribes. These Black Seminoles would be called Mascogos, a name that comes from Muskogee, the language shared by many of the tribes of the Southeast. Mexican Civil War led to the Black Seminoles migrating back across the Rio Grande when slavery ended after the Civil War. The moves were encouraged by the US government, which wanted the Seminoles and the Black Seminoles to prevent raids into Texas. This was at the end of the Civil War. The Black Seminoles had been invited to return to the United States to serve in a special ops unit to combat hostile tribes and enforce martial law in the South during Reconstruction. Those that accepted were promised land and retirement pensions at the end of their service. This had motivated them greatly. They had believed the United States on their word and had taken up the deal, trusting as they can be, for good and survival. The US Army recruited Black Seminoles as scouts. This forerunner of the Green Berets or Navy SEALs quickly developed the reputation as the finest military unit in the West. It was soon expanded into being the Seminole Negro Scout Troop of the new 10th Cavalry Regiment. In 1875, 3 of the scouts won the Congressional Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, in a single engagement with the Comanche Indians on the Pecos River. However, when it came time for them to retire, although the Black Seminoles became known as the best scouts in the best cavalry regiment in the West and won 4 medals of honor, not one of them ever did receive land or a pension thereafter. The US government officials said that it had lost the original treaty and had no record of them serving in the US Army. Like seriously? Even heirs of the Black Seminoles who became the famed Buffalo Soldiers of the Western frontier had to insist that the Army said they would be given their land in return for their military service. But no such documents ever did surface. In 1873, command of the Scouts was given to Lieutenant John Bullis, writes Katarina Vittich in a 2002 research paper, The Mascogos, Native Americans, African Americans, Mexicans. She continues, Under Latin bullies, the Scouts would spend the next 10 years as a major force in the eradication of Indian and bandit depredations in that area of Texas. Every commander who worked with the Scouts praised them for their courage and their skills, and those who worked most closely with them were the most vehement in their protests at the abandonment and mistreatment of the Mascogos by the US government. The Scouts would win 4 Medals of Honor, an incredible statistic for their tiny numbers. They served valiantly in a number of capacities until they were disbanded in 1914, but the US government kept none of its promises to them. She adds, "At the height of the Indian Wars, when the Scouts were continuously in the field providing invaluable service to the US Army and the citizens of Texas, their families and community were starving because the government had cut off their rations and would give them no land or supplies for farming. Instead, some black Seminoles stole cattle to feed their families. Texas cattle ranchers sent hired gunmen to threaten or kill black Seminoles. When John Horse was shot and captured, Wildcat paid his ransom. With little hope of changes, many black Seminoles crossed the Rio Grande again to live in Mexico. The US Army had disbanded the remaining Black Scouts empty-handed in 1914. Even Medal of Honor winners? There was neither land nor pensions for any of these loyal-minded black Seminoles. This would mean that they were being tricked all along by the US into their bidding, their crafts, skills and strength exploited yet again, only to be left high and dry in the end. Yet another humiliating betrayal of the blacks this was, by the United States. In 1842, the Army forcibly removed them, along with their Indian comrades, to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, in the unsettled West. The black Seminoles, exiled from their Florida strongholds, were forced to continue their struggle for freedom on the western frontier. In Oklahoma, the government put them under the authority of the Creek Indians, slave owners who tried to curb their freedom, and white slave traders came at night to kidnap their women and children. However, after all said and done, today, there are still small black Seminole communities scattered by war across North America and the West Indies. The Black Indians live on Andros Island in the Bahamas, where their ancestors escaped from Florida after the First Seminole War. The Seminole Freedmen, the largest group, live in rural Seminole County, Oklahoma, where they are still official members of the Seminole Indian Nation. The Mascogos dwell in the dusty desert town of Nacimiento in the state of Coahuila in northern Mexico. And finally, the Scouts live in Bracketville, Texas, outside the walls of the old fort where their grandfathers served in the US cavalry. These groups have lost almost all contact with one another, but they have all retained the memory of their ancestors' gallant fight for freedom in the Florida wilderness. In 1978, Dr. Ian Hancock discovered that elders among the Texas Scouts still speak a dialect of Gullah, 140 years after their ancestors were exiled from Florida, and as much as 200 years after their early ancestors escaped from rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. Both the Oklahoma and Texas groups, though deeply conscious of their Florida heritage, were unaware of their connection with the Gullah in South Carolina and Georgia. They did not know precisely where their slave ancestors had come from before fleeing into the Florida wilderness. The Oklahoma Seminole freedmen still possess a rich traditional culture combining both African and American Indian elements. They continue to eat rice as a characteristic part of their diet, sometimes applying a sauce of okra or spinach leaves, like the Gullah, and like their distant relatives in West Africa. In closing, it is said that in the year 1970, the Indian Claims Commission had awarded the Seminoles, of both Oklahoma and Florida, collectively, $12,347,500 for the land taken from them by the US military. This brings us to the end of yet another video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.